Hello friends, and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering video. Today I want to talk about my 10 favorite commander cards from the new Magic set Aetherdrift. And I guess I'll just preface this by saying overall, this set hasn't really spoken to me a whole lot. In fact, I'd say that that's putting it pretty lightly. I'm not a huge fan of the sort of goofy, off the wall, Mad Max style Hot Wheels, whatever it is that they were trying to go for with this set. A lot of the art and the aesthetic and the sort of premise behind what they're doing with this one just felt really kind of goofy and jarring and sort of, I don't know, thematically wacky in a way that just didn't really rub me in a good way. So I'm not a huge fan of this set. I don't think I'm alone in expressing that opinion. It seems like it has had quite a bit of critique on the internet as well. But I do think that there are a handful of very neat cards in this set, regardless. So I want to just sort of go through a list of 10 of them that stood out to me and that I think are pretty cool and that I'll probably try playing with going forward. So let's just get right into it. And we will start with Voyager Glidecar. This one is only one white mana for an artifact vehicle, and it is a 2/3, but since it's a vehicle, it's not inherently a creature. You need to crew it for one, which means you need a creature with at least one power. You need to tap that creature, and then this artifact vehicle turns into a creature until end of turn. So it's a 1 mana 2/3. When it enters the battlefield, scry 1, and then it has another activated ability where you can tap 3 other untapped creatures you control, and until end of turn, this vehicle becomes an artifact creature and gains flying. And you put a +1/+1 counter on it. Um, this might not look like a lot, especially for the commander environment. But I just think that this card kind of does everything that it's trying to do very effectively and very efficiently. Because again, this is only one white mana, and the fact that you just get to scry right off the bat as soon as it comes down already, scry 1 for 1 mana isn't worth it. But the fact that you're going to just immediately scry 1, get to set up your draw for the next turn, and then just kind of for the rest of the game, because nobody's going to remove this intentionally unless it gets wrathed away. For the rest of the game, you're going to have this 2/3 vehicle that's really easy to crew. You only need crew 1 to turn it into a 2/3 creature until end of turn. Or again, you can tap 3 other creatures you control to turn it into actually a 3/4 because it gets a +1/+1 counter. So you turn it into a 3/4 flyer until end of turn. And the really great thing about that also is that the +1/+1 counter just stays on it, even when it turns back into a vehicle and stops being a creature. So that way, the next time that you crew it, it's going to be a little bit bigger. I don't think that this is a card that you're going to want to play in like every one of your commander decks, but I do think in decks that are just going wide with a lot of 1/1 tokens, or even if your commander only has 1 power and you're not necessarily trying to attack with it, this is a really cool thing to do with just 1 power creatures that otherwise aren't doing a whole lot else. Especially if this is already on the field and then you make a bunch of tokens, you can just immediately use one of those tokens that are summoning sick to crew this thing, get in for it turns your 1/1 into a 2/3, which is a decent upgrade in terms of stats. And again, if you have 3 creatures, if you made a bunch of tokens, you can tap 3 of them at instant speed, to make this permanently a little bit bigger with that +1/+1 counter, and essentially crew it into a 3/4 flying creature until end of turn. So I kind of just like everything that this is doing. Again, just for 1 mana is really nice. It's not going to be the best card to draw, obviously, in the late game, but even then, the fact that you can just play it for 1 mana and scry 1 to set up the next draw that you have after this isn't nothing, and it's going to help even later on in the game. So I really like this card. If you're in a deck that just has a lot of 1/1s lying around, why not just turn one of those 1/1s into a 2/3 that dodges board wipes and can incrementally get bigger over the course of the game, but still not draw enough attention to itself to where your opponent is going to want to blow removal on this thing. So yeah, overall, I think it kind of just does a lot for 1 mana. I'm gonna be trying it out in, I don't know, some of my decks and just sort of seeing how it does. Obviously, I think that this has some potential in standard as well, but mostly we're talking about commander for today. So yeah, I think this is a really cool card. Let's move on to number 2. March of the World Ooze. If you've seen my Slime Against Humanity deck tech that I did previously for this channel, you probably had a feeling that I was going to have to put this card on the list. It's really great in a Slime Against Humanity deck because the slime tokens that Slime Against Humanity makes are 0/0s. But let me not get too far ahead of myself right here. We'll read the card first. It's a 3 mana and then 3 green mana for a total of 6 enchantment. And it says creatures you control have base power and toughness 6/6 and are oozes in addition to their other types. And then whenever an opponent casts a spell, if it's not their turn, you create a 3/3 green elephant creature token. But because of that first static line of text there, that elephant token is actually going to be a 6/6 ooze green elephant token. So this is a very powerful card, and not just in that Slime Against Humanity deck, although I will be finding a slot for it in that deck. I think if you're in a deck that's just going wide with a lot of smaller creatures, this is a fantastic option. If you're making a bunch of 1/1s, even if you're making a bunch of 2/2s, getting to upgrade those to 6/6s permanently for as long as this is out on the board. This isn't just an overrun, right? For overrun, you pay 5 mana, and until end of turn, you make all of your creatures gigantic. This you're paying 6 mana, so just one more, and it permanently, for as long as this is out on the board, makes all of your creatures gigantic. One downside that I guess this has in comparison to Overrun is it doesn't make your creatures that are already big bigger. But if you're in a deck that just has a lot of small creatures, this is a really fantastic way of just killing somebody out of nowhere and putting a ton of power onto your side of the table. And that second line of text is not the second ability is not irrelevant either. I think that most of the time what that's going to do is sort of incentivize your opponents to play at sorcery speed rather than playing stuff on other people's turns. But great, let's keep our opponents honest. Let's keep those blue players at the table honest. If somebody does need to cast a counter spell or an end step removal spell or something like that, you're getting a 6/6 every time something like that happens. So either if it's keeping people from playing interaction on other people's turns, great. Or if it's giving you 6/6 body every time somebody does do something like that, even if you just get one token off of this. Let's say you get one token off of this, right? All of a sudden, you've paid 6 mana for a 6/6 elephant creature, and you have pumped the rest of your team into 6/6s as well. So I think that this card just does a whole lot. I really like that mode of it where it sort of keeps people from playing at instant speed, but again, just that permanent overrun ability in a go wide's tokeny kind of deck is going to kill people out of nowhere. This is sort of like a you have to kill this on site kind of enchantment, and if your opponents can't do anything about it and you have a board of smaller creatures that suddenly are gigantic ooze creatures, this is going to end the game. I think it's just generically good enough to go in most decks that are going wide with small tokens. Okay, this is an interesting one. I haven't heard a whole lot of people talking about Riverchurn Monument, but it is 1 and a blue for a total of 2 mana for an artifact that says you can pay 1 mana and tap this to, and then any number of target players each mill 2 cards. And then it has a second ability that's an exhaust ability, which means you can only activate an exhaust ability one time, period, ever. And then once you have activated that exhaust ability, it has been exhausted and you cannot do it anymore. But this exhaust ability says pay 4 mana and tap this card, and any number of target players each mill cards equal to the number of cards in their graveyards. So, where to start with this one? There is so much that can be done with this card. For one, I think that this is just a reasonable win condition for a mill control deck. Maybe not in Commander because decks are larger, but again, the fact that you can target 2 players with this means that you are going to be milling people consistently. Um, and as long as you're sort of controlling the board state and just continually milling people with this, you can do a lot with just that. Obviously, that second ability, if you can somehow get an opponent to have roughly half of their library in their graveyard, if you've traumatized them, you can just use that exhaustibility to mill the rest of their deck, which is kind of hilarious. But another sort of maybe less intuitive part of this card that I really appreciate is the way that it interacts with the top deck. In Commander, you're going to see a lot of scrying, you're going to see a lot of surveilling, you're going to see a lot of tutors that tutor cards to the top of people's libraries. You'll see brainstorms, or I've heard people even talking about using this card, excuse me, with Lantern of Insight, which is a 1 mana artifact that makes it so that every single player has to play with the top card of their library revealed. I think that's a hilarious use for this card. I don't know if it actually makes it into those modern Lantern control decks, but honestly, the fact that you can target 2 players, so if you and your opponent, if you're looking at both of your top cards, your opponent has something on top of their deck that you don't want them to draw, and then you have something on top of your deck that also you don't want to draw, the fact that you can just activate this for 1 mana to mill your opponent's piece and mill you into something ideally better that you would prefer to draw is a fantastic option for this card. So I just think that there's a lot going on. Again, if somebody goes for their Vampiric Tutor, basically people cannot Vampiric Tutor, Worldly Tutor, Enlightened Tutor, Mystic Tutor, while this card is on the board, because it tutors to the top, and then all you have to do is pay 1 mana, and oops, the card that you just tutored is now in your graveyard. Maybe they're being sly about it and they actually tutored something that they want to put into the graveyard on top, but if your opponent's that smart, then kudos to them, honestly. So I just think that there's a lot going on with this. If you're trying to mill yourself, it's a really efficient way of doing that. Again, if it's in a shell where you're sort of milling yourself a lot and then you use that exhaustibility on yourself, you can put a huge chunk of your library into your graveyard just very effectively with this card. So I don't know. I think that there's just a lot going on here. I think that it's pretty great in mill strategies. I think it's really great in just general like top deck kind of control strategies, whether you're controlling your own deck, your opponent's deck, or both. You can do both at the same time because you can target multiple players. The first ability lets you choose 2 players. No, I'm wrong. Any number of target players. Wow, I've been reading that wrong. I apologize. So yeah, both of these let you choose any number of target players that you want. So in Commander, that's even better. So I just think that this is a really cool card, and it can potentially do a lot. So keep your eye out for it. We're going to move on. I think, yeah. So this next one is a bit of a cheat because it's a cycle of 5 different cards. If you didn't already check out my Commander Pauper deck tech for Tyrox Saurid Tyrant, check that out above. I'll link it in the video. I talk about these guys in a lot more depth in that video, so I won't go too far into it here, but this is a cycle of 5 vanilla legendary creatures, all at uncommon, so they can all be Pauper commanders, which is a format that I really like. But I just think in general also, all of these guys have pretty remarkable stats. So you're paying 2 mana for a 0/8, 2 mana for a 4/1, 2 mana for a 3/3. You're paying 3 mana for a 7/2 or 5 mana for a 9/7. Like all of these are sort of just like beyond what is considered normal in terms of stat to mana cost ratio. And I think they're just beyond that enough to make a lot of them playable. I don't know if they're necessarily playable in Commander. However, I do think that they're fun hipster Commander choices. And again, sort of check out the deck tech that I did for Tyrox for the Pauper Commander deck tech. I think they all make very interesting Pauper Commanders. Some more than others, but I think all of them are playable as Pauper Commanders. So yeah, check out that video if you want to hear me talk more about them. But I do really like these guys, and there's some of the really standout cards from this set to me that sort of made an impression. So moving on to Market Backwalker. Uh, if you see an artifact construct creature that's a 0/0 and there's two X's at the top, you should know to beware. It could be a potentially broken card, as history has proven. And I don't think that this one is necessarily broken like some of its predecessors, but I do think that this is a very strong card. Or maybe I should just say it's a generically strong card at kind of like any mode that you play it for. So I like playing this for 2 mana. I like playing I you know what? I should probably read what the card does first. So let's do that first. It is an XX construct that's a 0/0, and it says this creature enters with X/1/1 counters on it. And then you can pay 4 mana to put a 1/1 counter on it, and then it says whenever it dies, draw a card for each 1/1 counter on it. So what I was saying before I got ahead of myself there is that you can pay X=1 for 2 mana to get a 1/1 creature that when it dies you draw a card. That's just kind of okay. Like honestly, getting a creature that you can chump block with that replaces itself, it's kind of like an Elvish Visionary, except you sort of have to wait to get the card until later. But I think the thing that makes this card a lot better than Elvish Visionary is that it's a 1/1 counter and it can be increased. So any kind of deck that's putting 1/1 counters on things, if you're just playing this for 2 mana, but then by any million different ways you can get one more 1/1 counter on it, all of a sudden if you paid 2 for this and then it dies and you're drawing 2, that's a really really good rate in terms of drawing cards, and it is not difficult to put a 1/1 counter on a creature. You can proliferate, you can have a hardened scales out, you can just play a card that says put a 1/1 counter on a thing. There's lots of different ways to do that. So I think that like any kind of deck that's doing 1/1 counter stuff is great. The other part of this card is you could pay it for you could play it for X=2, and then you would pay a total of 4 mana for a 2/2 creature. When it dies, draw 2 cards. That's also just kind of okay. A 4 mana body that draws you 2 cards is like kind of playable already. But again, the real secret sauce with this card is finding ways to put extra 1/1 counters on it. Obviously, it can put extra 1/1 counters on itself later on, but paying 4 mana to do that isn't exactly where you want to be unless you're really in a pinch. It's nice to have the option, but again, I think if you're just finding creative ways that are just sort of already in line with the strategy of what you're trying to do with your deck, whether that be proliferating or putting extra 1/1 counters on things or having a hardened scales down, like that kind of stuff, I think that this card is really going to shine in those kind of decks. It will draw you a lot of cards, and especially if you can start recurring this thing too, I think that there's definitely something to that. If you're in a deck that can sort of loop creatures over and over, this is a good one to do that with. But let's keep pushing here. We have Oil Deep Gearhulk as our next card on this list. And first of all, that art, I had to pick that special version of the art. Sometimes I like the original art better than the special versions they've been doing nowadays, but this one is just absolutely gorgeous. So nice job to Chun Lo with this really sweet Neon Genesis Evangelion style mech on this card here. But let's read what it does. It's 2 blue mana and 2 black mana for an artifact creature construct. It is a 4/4. It has lifelink and ward 1. And then it says when this creature enters, look at target player's hand. You may choose a card from it. If you do, that player discards that card and then draws a card. So usually these kind of abilities where you're looking at one player's hand and making them discard a specific card are not very good in Commander because you just have too many opponents' hands to worry about. You can pick one opponent, maybe make them discard their best thing, but then you still have two other opponents that you really didn't do anything with. And so that's why cards like Thoughtseize and Duress don't really see play in Commander. Um, this one, however, I think just comes with a good enough body to make it worthwhile. And there's a couple of other like interesting nuances that go along with this card, but honestly, just paying 4 mana for a 4/4 lifelink with Ward 1 is kind of nice to just have that. It'll gain you life back and kind of get you back in the game when you're at a low life total later on in the game. But yeah, and then just being able to sort of look at who's the biggest threat at the table or who you're most afraid of, like having a counter spell or something like that. Picking them, making them discard whatever interaction that they have in their hand. That's the other interesting thing about this one is really you can make your opponent discard whatever card they might have that would be able to remove this thing. So that's another line you can take with this. But another piece is that when it enters, look at target player's hand. So you could, in theory, target yourself as well. If there's a card in your hand that you don't really want and that you would rather sort of rummage away to find another card, you can do that too. So you discard the card you don't want and then draw another card that you do want. So yeah, like I'm trying to like think about it in terms of if this was just a 4 mana 4/4 lifelink Ward 1, and when it enters the battlefield, rummage, discard a card and draw a card, that would kind of be pretty good also, I think. I would be interested in playing something like that, I think. So the fact that this can just at its baseline do that for you, but then also potentially make your opponent get rid of their combo piece that they've been holding one half of their combo in their hand for the whole game, or, making your opponent discard their board wipe that they were planning to use to maybe get rid of this and whatever other troublesome things are on the board. You can just kind of do a lot with it if you know what you're looking out for and you know what you don't want your opponents to have. So yeah, I don't think this is going to see all the play. It's not like the most bombastic, splashiest effect, but I think it's just pretty good. And I think that if played correctly, you can do some really nasty stuff with this card, both in Standard and in Commander. Again, I at the time of this video haven't really played a whole lot of like Arena or seen sort of like what people are playing at events and that kind of thing, but I think this has potential for Standard play. Obviously, it's competing with a lot of other powerful 4-drop creatures, talking about you, Shieldred. But yeah, I think that this has potential to see play in Standard, and I think it's worth trying in Commander too, just because it does so much for you, and that body is really nice. So that's that one. Next on our list, Ovia Automech Artisan is 4 mana, 3 and a green for a 1/2 legendary human artificer. And she says each creature that's attacking one of your opponents has trample. We'll get back to that one, but the other part of the ability on this card is you can pay a green mana and tap her, and you can put target creature or vehicle card from your hand onto the battlefield. And if you put an artifact onto the battlefield this way, you put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. So the idea being, like, if you put a vehicle into play with this, it gets 2 +1/+1 counters. If you put an artifact creature into play with this, it gets 2 +1/+1 counters. So there you go, 1 mana for a 13/13 Blightsteel Colossus, right? I think that that's sort of like what I hear a lot of people talking about with this card, because this is definitely one that I have heard a lot of people talking about and feeling excited about. I mean, you can have this in the command zone. It's an Elvish Piper that you can have in your command zone. Just pay 1 green mana to cheat a creature or a big dummy from your hand out onto the field. That's great. It's obviously like probably the more powerful part of the card. But really what I like about this card is that first ability. And I think that even if it just had that first ability, I would still be interested in taking a look at it. Each creature that's attacking one of your opponents has trample. So it's worded in such a way that, yes, all of your attacking creatures are going to get trample. It gives all of your guys trample. But the other side of that is when your opponents are attacking each other, their attacking creatures that are going at each other also get trample. So in the situations where everybody's got a few chump blockers on board and one person's got a gigantic creature, one opponent has a gigantic creature, this is just going to say, like, hey, if you attack me, I'll block with my bear. If you attack this fellow over here, it's going to get trample, and even if they do chump block, they're still going to have to take a lot of damage. So you do the math, I'll let you make your decision, but that sounds like a good idea to me. And I really like the political implication of sort of incentivizing opponents to attack each other. There are a lot of cards recently that kind of have that kind of pseudo ability on it, and I love that that's just sort of like snuck into this sort of like bombastic card with this huge ability that can put gigantic people into play for only 1 mana. But it's also like, yeah, I can do that, but also maybe attack over there, you know? Um, so yeah, I think the second ability is obviously very strong. It's also kind of slow, right? Like, and predictable. So this is just gonna sit there on the table. You're telling me I'm gonna pay 4 mana, have this sit here, wait a whole turn cycle of opponents looking at this 2 toughness creature and have them be like, he probably won't put a 13/13 Blightsteel Colossus into play next turn, but maybe he will. Like, it's very telegraphed, and so I think that is a downside to this card. It's a downside with the original Elvish Piper as well. But again, I think that first line of text kind of makes up for it. It's almost like helping opponents a little bit, as long as they're not attacking you. It kind of helps your opponents and maybe creates enough goodwill to have them not immediately kill it on sight, but that also might be some wishful thinking because that's a pretty scary ability to just have sitting on the table. But yeah, I like this card. I like it in any deck that has a lot of large creatures that you want to just give trample. I like it in any deck that has a lot of creatures that you want to maybe potentially be able to cheat into play if you can have this live for a turn. I also really like it in the command zone. I think this is a sweet commander option. So yeah, cool card. Moving on, what's next? Oh, okay. So our next card is a controversial one. This is Radiant Lotus. This is a 6 mana artifact that has an activated ability where you can tap it and sacrifice 1 or more artifacts, choose a color, target player adds 3 mana of the chosen color for each artifact sacrificed this way. This, this card is crazy. It's controversial because a lot of people like myself are going to be talking it up really heavy and saying that there's like just so much play and raw power to this card. But it's controversial because I've heard a lot of other people say, well, what are you talking about? It's not that good. It's just 6 mana to get more mana, but you already have to pay 6 mana up front, and you have to have other things set up like artifacts on the table and that kind of thing. And like, yes, I hear all of that. And yet, the amount of value that this can produce for you, it just kind of makes all of that negligible. Yes, it's not going to go in every deck. You want to play this in decks that happen to have a lot of artifacts laying around. I have a Farid Enterprising Salvager deck that just like makes scrap tokens every time one of my artifacts goes to the graveyard. I've talked about doing a deck tech for that video. I might still try and do it, but yeah, let me know in the comments below if you're interested in. It's sort of like a eggs artifact style scrappy combo-y deck with Farid Enterprising Salvager. Anyways, this card is going to be insane in that deck, obviously, but also there's a lot of decks just in general that have a lot of artifact. There's so many artifact tokens. You got clue tokens, you got incubator tokens, you got blood tokens, you got food tokens, you got scrap tokens, you got there's just so many different kinds of tokens that are just sort of running around in the wild right now. And so any kind of deck that just happens to coincidentally make a few of those and have them lying around, this card is going to be crazy. If it comes down and you have a couple of artifacts, notice it can sacrifice itself also to make 3 mana. But let's say that you don't want to just immediately sacrifice it the turn it comes down, and you have a couple of other artifacts that you can sacrifice. Yes, you pay the 6 mana, but then you can just immediately sacrifice 2 artifacts to get the 6 mana back. It reimburses itself by just sacrificing 2 artifacts, and all of a sudden you've spent 0 mana for this card. And since you didn't sacrifice itself, you sacrificed other artifacts, you get to untap with it and then keep using it. That's one thing you can do with this card. Another thing that you can do with this card is you can build up a board of a bunch of gigantic artifacts and sacrifice all of them at once, including this own card, and make, I don't know, 30 mana with this thing. Like the amounts of mana that it actually is going to end up creating for you are just like so obscene that like I think a lot of the people that are criticizing this card aren't fully appreciating how much mana this can actually make. It makes 9 mana easy. It makes 12 mana fairly easy, especially if you decide to sacrifice itself with it. So it can almost be used like a ritual also, where you pay some mana up front, but then you get more mana out of what you paid. So you pay the 6 mana to play this, then you sacrifice it and two other artifacts, and suddenly you just catapulted yourself from 6 mana to 9 mana. And with 9 mana, you can cast, some Eldrazi. You can cast some really gross, powerful cards. You can cast a Worldfire. Check out my video about Worldfire. Um, you can cast some gross cards with 9 mana, and it's not that hard to get 12 mana with this card either. If you start sort of like looping this card and bringing it back from your graveyard onto the field, you can just do absolutely disgusting things, and it's going to if you have some kind of mechanism for doing that, this is going to pay all the mana that is required in order to do that for you. So, yeah, I think this card is very strong. Yes, it costs 6 mana. I get it, but the amount of mana that this is going to net you is just obscene in comparison to that measly 6 mana that you paid up front for it. Um, so yeah, watch out for this one. In this case, I would say yes, buy into the hype. I'm not telling you to literally go buy this card. I don't know what the price is going to end up being. I'm hoping I can get it for cheaper than $20. We'll see how that all goes. But yes, this card is very strong. Moving on to Quag Feast. This card is weird. I can't really tell what's going on here. It looks like there's like some guys that maybe fell off the racetrack and are getting eaten by bugs or something. I'm not 100% sure on the flavor what's going on here, but this is a 2 mana, 1 in a black for a sorcery that says choose target creature, planeswalker, or vehicle, mill 2 cards, and then destroy the chosen permanent if its mana value is less than or equal to the number of cards in your graveyard. Um, so the way that this actually works is when you cast this, you have to choose a target. And then it's going to go to your graveyard and count as a card in your graveyard once you've cast this card. And you're going to mill two more cards. So at the very least, even if you have no other cards in your graveyard, when you play this, you can destroy an artifact, a vehicle, planeswalker, or creature that costs 3 or less mana right off the bat. If you have any more than that, then, if you have 1, 2, or 3 cards in your graveyard, this is going to start hitting just about any creature, planeswalker, or vehicle that it can target, which is what you would hope and expect to get from a removal spell. You want it to target as many things as possible, if not all things that it can target. The thing that makes this one really special is, A, it's only 2 mana, so that's already a pretty efficient cost for a removal spell. But then B, it also is actively milling you. So for any deck that's trying to mill itself, this is kind of an amazing way to just incidentally get a couple of cards milled into your graveyard in addition to just having a removal spell. It is hindered by the fact that it's a sorcery. Most of what you want for your removal spells are you're going to want them to be instant speed. Having that instant speed is really nice for being able to interact on your opponent's turns and whatnot. So the sorcery speed does hurt this, but I do think that sort of downside is made up by the fact that it is it's a mill piece. It's a card that's going to mill you in addition to just killing pretty much anything for 2 mana. So any kind of deck you have, again, that you want to be doing self-milling stuff in, I would absolutely consider running this card as part of your removal package because, yeah, having incidental mill for 2 cards plus a removal spell is great. That's all I wanted to say about that one. We have one more card, and that is Valor's Flagship. So this is 4 generic and 3 white, 7 total mana for a legendary artifact vehicle. It is a 7/7 vehicle, and it has flying, first strike, and lifelink. It has crew 3, and then it also has cycling for X and 3 mana. And you, so basically, you would pay whatever you want to for X, including 0 if you want, and then pay that 3 mana to discard this card and draw a card. But it also says when you cycle this card, create X/1/1 colorless pilot creature tokens with this token saddles mounts and crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater. So that's a lot of words. What is this actually doing? This is a big, bulky vehicle that you can pay 7 mana for in the late game if you want to just get a big vehicle down. That's not bad. It's going to gain you a lot of life, so that's helpful, especially in that late game. But the main reason why I really like this card is that cycling ability, and I like it for a couple of reasons. The first reason being that just being able to throw this away in the early game when you don't have 7 mana to play it and then draw a new card is really helpful. Being able to make those pilots is really helpful. And the neat thing about the pilots being able to crew something as though their power were 2 higher than it already is if you pay X is 1 for the cycling cost on this card, you can pay 3 and X is 1 for a total of 4 mana to discard this card, draw a card, and make 1 pilot token. And that 1 pilot token that you made is actually going to be able to crew this thing for its crew 3 cost, if you have some way of then reanimating this from your graveyard onto the battlefield. So that's what I really like about this card in any kind of deck that's doing reanimator stuff for specifically reanimating artifacts, which is admittedly kind of a narrow niche. But if you are in a deck that has a reliable ability to be able to reanimate artifacts, I think this is one of the best targets that you can have for that. Not because it's the most powerful target necessarily, but because it does all the rest of the work for you. It puts itself into your graveyard to be reanimated. It replaces itself in doing so, and maybe even draws you that reanimation spell off of the cycling ability. It makes a pilot for itself that can crew itself, even if you just make 1 of them. It could potentially make a lot of tokens for you if you needed at instant speed to just put a bunch of bodies onto the table for whatever reason. There's lots of reasons why you might want to do that. And if as long as you have enough mana, you could do that with this card. Another cool thing is if you do use that cycling ability, unless somebody has a stifle effect, it's kind of uncounterable because it's an ability that you're activating rather than actually casting a spell. So you're making a bunch of tokens that's uncounterable, putting this thing into your graveyard, drawing a new card that might be the reanimation spell that could then reanimate this onto the table and have a pilot waiting around to crew it. So I just think that's a really neat package. It has a lot of words, but effectively it's kind of simple in its execution, and I think it does what it's trying to do really well. And yeah, if you're in a vehicle deck, if you're in kind of like a weird artifact sort of reanimation deck, this is really good for that. Doesn't go too far beyond those niches, but I do think in those kind of strategies, this is a very cool option for those decks. But yeah, that's basically all I have to say. Those are my 10 cards from Aetherdrift. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of the video if you made it this far. So happy to have you still have you here. And as a reward, what we'll do is for the end of this video, we will do a reading from my Magic Theros themed Oracle Tarot-esque deck. And as usual, as I'm getting these cards shuffled up, I would encourage you to bring your attention inwards. Slow down that breathing. Focus on your breath. Give me a long, deep breath through the nose. And out through the mouth. Give me a couple more of those breaths while we're shuffling up here. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. It looks like this card wants to come out, so we're going to use this one. So let's see what we've got. It is Inspiration. Am I reading that right? It is Inspiration. Cool. This is Keranos, god of storms, I believe, on the plane of Theros. You can see this large, muscular dude carrying a huge bolt of lightning over his head, and he is poised to throw that lightning, but it also kind of looks like his head is turned upwards towards the sky as if he were looking up and admiring something greater. And it also looks like there is a large a large owl that is swooping in behind him. Almost looks like it's about ready to perch on his shoulder there. And I guess you could say that that is the embodiment of the inspiration. This almost looks like a different interpretation of those cartoons where you see the light bulb blink into existence over their head when they get an idea or when they are struck by inspiration. This is just like the most intense version of that. This man is inspired. So, yeah, that's a cool card to pull. Inspiration is something that is just so important as we navigate our creative lives in this world. I'll speak for myself. It's been challenging to try to find the energy to create these kind of videos and to create other artistic personal endeavors that I'm working on in the midst of the grind of, everyday life. But I do think that it's important to pay attention to when we feel inspired. And when inspiration does strike, it's not always predictable. But when it does come, it's hard to miss. And when you do feel that bolt of lightning crackling around your head, do something with it. Paint a picture. Play a song on your whatever instrument of choice. Record a YouTube video. Write a poem. Do all that stuff. It's important. So, yeah. Thanks again for sticking around. Let's do our best to stay inspired. And I hope to catch you in the next video.